Hello there, and welcome to my guide for painting the Star Wars Shatterpoint Certified Guild Squad Pack. As you can see, I haven't fully assembled everything. This is to make the whole painting process a lot easier. So Grogu and his bassinet are separated, as is the head and cloak part of the Mandalorian. As you can see, I also sprayed up the Mandalorian and IG-11 matte black, and the rest was sprayed up with some matte white. Both of these were sprayed with Colourforge paints. I'm going to kick things off with IG-11. I'm going to paint the entire model except the base with some Iron Warriors. After that, I'm then going to give the entire model a wash with some Nuln oil. I'm then going to use some Abaddon black to neaten up the cloak of the Mandalorian. And this will also receive a wash with some Nuln oil. While that wash dries, we're going to move on to Grief and the Mandalorian. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use some Dryad bark to paint the boots on Grief. I'm also going to paint the wider part of his belt. As for the Mandalorian, it's his boots and his cloth underneath his armor that we'll be painting. Then I'll use some Mournfang brown to paint Grief's trousers. And I'm also going to paint his shoulder pads as well. For the Mandalorian, we're going to use that colour to paint the straps and the pouches littered across his body, also his belt. I'm then going to use some Steel Legion drab to paint Grief's shirt. And I'll also paint the butt of the Mandalorian's rifle. I'm then going to use some Zandri dust to paint Grief's cloak, along with little Grogu's robes. Then I'm going to use some XV88 to paint the sleeves on Grief, along with the tips of the fingers of the Mandalorian. All of the browns we've just painted will then get a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. While that dries, we're going to move back to Mandalorian's cape, and we're going to use some Corvus black for the first highlight. The second will be a 50-50 mix of Corvus black and Eshin grey. And the final highlight will be Eshin grey just by itself. Then we're going to work on the Dryad bark, and for that we're going to do a 50-50 mix of Dryad bark and Gothor brown. We'll keep it that same mix, but we'll add some more Gothor brown to it to create a 70-30 mix in favour of Gothor brown for the next highlight. Then for the Mournfang brown, we're going to relayer that using some Mournfang brown. Remember to avoid any recesses, as we want to keep that lovely shading. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Mournfang brown and Skag brown for the first highlight. And the second will be Scrag brown just by itself. Then I'll relayer the Steel Legion drab with some Steel Legion drab. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Steel Legion drab and Talon sand for the first highlight. And the second highlight will be Talon sand just by itself. Then we'll move back to the cape and Grogu, and for that I'm going to relayer the Zandri dust with Zandri dust. Then I'll create a 70-30 mix of Zandri dust and Ushabti bone in favour of Zandri dust for the first highlight. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Zandri dust and Ushabti bone. Then we'll relayer the XV88, which will be followed by a 50-50 mix of XV88 and Ushabti bone, which will then be followed by the same mix but in the ratio of 70-30 in favour of Ushabti bone for the final highlight. Then I'm going to start work on Grogu's pod by giving it a coat of Grey Sear. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Grey Sear and Matte White, followed by a final highlight of Matte White by itself. For the inside, I'm going to give it a coat of Dryad bark. This will then get a wash with some Nuln oil. For Grief's gloves, I'm going to paint those with some Abaddon black. And I'm going to paint his blasters with some Iron Warriors. I'm also going to do the same with the Mandalorian's rifle. These areas will then receive a wash with some Nuln oil. Mando's got a couple of areas on his armour that are actually blue, so I'm going to paint those with some Thunderhawk blue. And then I'll also wash those with some Nuln oil. I'm then going to paint Grief's face with some Catachan flesh. This will then get a wash with some Reichland flesh shade. While all those washes dry, I'm going to use some Wild Rider red to paint the markings on Grogu's pod. Then I'll do a 50-50 mix of Thunderhawk blue and matte white to do the first highlight on the blue areas on the Mandalorian. Followed by the same mix, but a 70-30 ratio in favour of matte white for the second. I'm then going to use some Corvus black to highlight Grief's gloves. I'll then use some Abaddon black to mark where Grief's eyes will be. This will be followed by some matte white. For finally, some more Abaddon black to mark in the pupils. I'm then going to use a 50-50 mix of Catachan flesh and Blood Reaver flesh for the first highlight of the skin. This will be followed by a coat of Blood Reaver flesh. Then a 50-50 mix of Blood Reaver flesh and Night Quester flesh. And then for the final highlight, some Night Quester flesh just by itself. I'm then going to use Iron Hand Steel to paint the bandoliers around IG-11. Any buckles on Grief. And then finally, I'll use it to paint the Mandalorian's armor. All of these areas will then get washed with some Nuln oil. While that wash dries, we're going to start on Grogu's skin, and for that we're going to use some Nurgling green. And very importantly, don't forget to paint his hands on his little basket. I actually completely forgot they were there, so I had to go back and make sure I actually redid that step. Then he'll get a coat with some Athonian camo shade. Next we'll move back to IG-11 and we're going to use Iron Hand Steel to give him a good dry brushing all over the model. We'll also use that Iron Hand Steel to highlight the buckles and the weapons on Grief. And of course we'll relayer the metal armor on the Mandalorian. We're then going to do a 50-50 mix of Iron Hand Steel and Stormhost Silver for the first highlight on the Mandalorian's armor. And for the second and final highlight, we're just going to use some Stormhost Silver just by itself. We'll also give IG-11 another dry brush with that same Stormhost Silver. Then I'm going to water down some Mournfang Brown, and I'm going to paint it strategically over IG-11 to create sort of patches of rust where he's basically been sitting out for a while. Then I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to paint Grief's hair. If you haven't done so, also paint his mustache at this stage as well. And there's a few wires on IG-11 as well as sort of some joints that I'm also going to paint black too. I'll then wash these areas with some Nuln oil. And once that wash is dry, I'll then use some Corvus black to give everything a quick highlight. Then I'm going to use some Abaddon black to paint in Grogu's eyes. Then we can start working on his skin, and for that I'm going to relayer the Nurgling green with some Nurgling green. And for the highlight, I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of Nurgling green and matte white. Then I'm going to use some Cadian flesh tone just to paint the inside of his ears. Then to add a tiny little bit of depth, I'm going to use some Reichland flesh shade, but just on the very sort of edges of his ears on the inside. And before we paint the bases, I'm going to quickly dot in IG-11's eyes with some Mephiston red. Then we'll use some XV88 to paint the muddy areas of the bases. This will be followed by an edge highlight of some Tau Light Ochre. Then I'll use Dawnstone to paint the concrete areas. And these will be edge highlighted with some Grey Seer. I'll then neaten up the rims of the bases with some Abaddon Black. And then the bases will get a wash with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. Once that wash is dried and you've glued Mandalorian back together, your miniatures will be finished. Once again, Atomic Mass really knocked out of the park with these miniatures. The Mandalorian and IG-11 in particular are very, very nice models to paint. It didn't take too long to paint whatsoever. In fact, it only took about 6 hours for the lot. They were quite enjoyable to paint, and I definitely would recommend painting them separated, but the Mandalorian pieces separated so you can get in there and really get all those details. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if it helped you, please think about giving it a thumbs up and maybe subscribe, and I will see you next time. Goodbye for now.